This morning at St. Peter's Basilica, the faithful lining up to say goodbye. At the center, facing the pews, the coffin carrying Pope Francis. Pope Francis's final moments remain shrouded in mystery, but his last words have deeply moved the world. What did he say before his passing? In this emotional journey through his final hour, we explore the powerful legacy he left behind and the impact of his final message. Join us as we reveal the touching details that continue to inspire millions. This is the story of faith, farewell, and the lasting words of a spiritual leader the world revered. The Easter that no one will ever forget, Easter Sunday in Roman Italy. Thousands of people were swarming St. Peter's Square, waving flags and applauding under the mild spring temperature. There were bells, choir, and cameras from all over the world that caught the event. Still, something was not right. There was something off about it. Pope Francis looked white when he got to the balcony. He had a soft smile on his face, but he looked smaller than ever. In this case, he wasn't standing, he was in his wheelchair. His hands were once strong and full of life, but now they were just a little shaky. It was hard for him to lift them for blessings, but he did it. Carefully and gradually, like each thing you do counts. His eyes looked heavy to other people. He did smile, but it looked like he had to work at it. Some people who were paying close attention thought it was more than just another Easter sermon. There was a sense of goodbye in it. He raised his hand, looked around the crowd, and then gave his last public speech. Let all of us pray for peace in Gaza and Ukraine. Only one thing. The name is short, simple, still strong, but it's the kind of sentence that leaves no one in the room feeling anything. Not only a caution, but also a prayer, a wish, goodbye. Later, Vatican observers said that his voice was different from what it had been before. Yes, it was calm, but deeper, not as fast. Some said it sounded like he had practiced it and was saying something he had been meaning to say for a while. He didn't talk about doctrine, future of the church. He talked about war, pain, and suffering among people, the things that are closest to his heart. Helpers walked him back to the entrance in a gentle way. This person put one hand on the armrest, the other fell on his chest just above his heart. For a short time, close-up cameras caught what could have been his last gift to the world. The crowd didn't know that this was their last chance to see him alive. Even so, there were still questions after that show. What made him look so calm? Why did he not say more? How come he looked so tired? Not a lot was said by the Vatican. In simple terms, he was resting after the service. There is no medical report, not an in-depth comment. Within the Vatican, though, the atmosphere changed. From inside, a number of close aides began to become very protective. Not as many people were around him. His already light calendar almost ran out of things to do. Later, an unnamed staff member said something strange. The Pope had turned down almost all meeting requests after Easter. People who knew about his health knew that it had been getting worse for months. Something that works. Not being able to breathe. Not much room to move. Pain all the time. His body had even told him in the past that he was ready to step down if it failed him. But he failed. He chose to serve all the way to the end. There are rumors going around inside the Apostolic Palace that Pope Francis may have planned for Easter Sunday to be his last public appearance. Not as a sign, but because of the time. This Easter, let us forgive, live in peace, and make amends. It would have been the most important goodbye for a man with his vision. This did not happen by chance. Sources say that he wrote and revised his speech by hand several times in the days before it was given. A few people even said he told his best friend, "I want this to be my last word to the world." That assistant never said anything public about it, but the time, the mood, and the energy of that day made a lot of questions come up. Also, most people don't know about the last-minute change that was made to the ceremony. He was supposed to give a longer homily at first. That was taken out in a sneaky way. There was no news, nothing but silence. The video from that day can be found online now. You will find little things if you pay close attention. His hand was shaking. He let out a shallow breath. He looked around the group for a little longer than usual. The soft way his fingers moved across his chest to make the shape of the cross, almost like a man finishing up one last job. From all sides, people who were watching felt something. There are a lot of comments on social media that say, "He looks so fragile, he doesn't seem okay, and I hope he's not saying goodbye." But no one was sure. Only the few people who lived inside the Vatican walls did. So the question still stands, Was all of this in the last message? Did he plan that moment because he knew it would be his last picture as Pope? Or was it just a coincidence? There's no way to know for sure. Things about that day pointed to more than just a normal blessing. It felt like the end. The whole world saw Pope that day. He was there, waving and smiling. But behind that smile was a man who was in pain and aware that his time on earth was short. The world didn't know what was going to happen either when he hid behind the curtains. You will be shocked by what he did that night when no one was around. As darkness fell, Pope Francis asked for solitude. But did he leave behind a message no one expected? His mysterious final night. After the Easter Mass, Pope Francis went back to his private apartment in the Apostolic Palace. The crowds had cheered and people all over the world had seen. A very small group of people knew what was going on behind the huge stone walls of the Vatican. Around 6:03 p.m., dinner showed up. It was a small dinner made by his personal cook who he had worked with for years. Not even a feast and no parties. There were only 2 helpers with him, his favorite nurse and his longtime secretary. A lot of people who came were turned away. He had asked people to be quiet. That night he could hear the soft hum of music from his room. A worker at the Vatican says he asked for a list of holy music, an opera by Bach, some say it was. Some say it was an old Argentine hymn from the chapel where he grew up. It was a personal choice in both cases. At some point in the evening, he asked his confessor to come see him. When the confessor, a priest whom the Pope fully trusted, showed up just after 8 p.m., he gave a lot of attention. There wasn't much time for the talk. No one else could get into the room, it was locked. What they said at that time stayed between them. After a while the confessor left without talking to anyone. Even though he looked tired, he seemed calm. That was the last spiritual experience that Francis was known to have before he died. Someone who had worked for him for more than 10 years had been called in just before midnight. Sources inside the Vatican say the Pope looked him in the eyes and said, "I'm ready." Not again. That's right. He had said this more than once in different places, but that evening it felt like the end of it. An important event took place around midnight. It was chosen not to take him to the hospital. In the past, suggestions made by the Vatican's medical staff were quietly turned down. He was told to stay at the Vatican by the Pope. He had lived and worked in the same room for years and prayed there. Why they did it? It wasn't about comfort. He believed that his last hours should be spent where he had served. Sources close to him say he turned down all drugs except for painkillers. Not even one machine, not even one wire. There was only him, 2 helpers, a nurse, and silence. In the morning, the nurse who stayed all night would say he had a smile when he passed. It wasn't a smile. Stress had nothing to do with it. It was peaceful. It got lighter around dawn, she said. At 7:35 a.m., it had stopped for good. Not a warning. There's no worry, only stillness. The apostolic chamber was immediately turned on. This is how the Vatican has always dealt with the death of a pope for hundreds of years. A small group led by the Camerlengo was told, the Pope's ring came off. The right official steps were taken exactly as they were written. The Vatican clock was stopped for a few minutes to mark the event. This was meant to be a symbolic stop in time. There was no one in the room, putting out candles. A quiet prayer was said. This is where the mystery gets more complicated. Some people in the Vatican were seen going in and out of his private study in the hours after he died. One account says that he took an envelope off his desk that was sealed. Many people believe he left behind last instructions, which could be about writing letters to world leaders, planning for his successor, or sending a spiritual message to his followers. On the other hand, the Vatican has not confirmed anything. One idea is that he wrote a letter weeks before Easter that would not be opened until after he died. Some people think it might have something to do with his job as Pope or with personal thoughts he had never shared in public. Not yet, because there's nothing to report. A file that was put on his nightstand was also seen by some visitors. Because it was labeled in Spanish, people thought it held his personal notes. It was gone soon after his body was moved, but has not been observed since. Was this his way of tying up loose ends? Was something he wanted to leave behind that we might never know about? That last night, not many announcements were made. No big ceremonies, just peaceful getting ready. He had reduced everything to what really counted. Not noisy at all, not one audience, just last notes of clarity, peace, and maybe closure. It was decided that the Pope, who had already traveled the world and greeted presidents, would end his journey with the people who had shown unconditional love for him. Not having any headlines, lack of spectacle, everything is simple. People who saw him that night could tell one thing for sure: he wasn't scared. He had helped others his whole life. Now he was ready to leave on his own terms. Early that morning it was dark in the Vatican grounds. Then steps came. There were candles that were flickering, and inside those walls a new story was already beginning. But the outside world hadn't caught up yet. Secrets he took to the grave. Even though he always seemed strong, Pope Francis, the beloved leader of the Catholic Church, had a lot of health problems that most people didn't find out about until after he died. His health problems were very private, and he usually didn't tell other people about them. Even his best friends who saw him every day didn't seem to know how bad things had gotten for him in the past few months. The Pope had been quietly taking care of a number of long-term illnesses for many years. Many of them were caused by health problems he had as a young man, like lung problems. Because of this, he couldn't breathe as well after having some of his lungs removed. Still, he stuck to his busy schedule, traveling the world and doing his job with the same energy that amazed many. But most people didn't know about the growing physical toll. Besides his lung illness, he also had terrible sciatica, a nerve pain that made it impossible for him to move in his legs and lower back. Sometimes the pain was so bad that he couldn't move freely, which made even simple things like walking hard for him. But Pope Francis had other problems besides these. In his last few years, he had a major surgery on his intestines. His overall health got worse after this surgery. At first, the Vatican played down how bad the surgery was, but people who knew him well knew it was hard on his body. He was weaker after the surgery, and it wasn't easy for him to get better. Pope Francis, who was one of the most well-known religious leaders in the world, chose not to talk about how bad his pain was, so his health problems stayed a secret. In February, just a few months before he died, there was a hospitalization panic at the Vatican. Many insiders started to worry that his condition was getting worse as rumors spread. Some people thought the Pope had pushed himself too far by working long hours and having a tight schedule, even though his health was getting worse. He had always been a very religious and devoted man, but people close to him began to worry that he was about to lose it. What's even more interesting is that the Pope kept serving, even though it hurt his body. Did he keep his closest advisors in the dark about how much he was hurting? Some people inside the Vatican say that the answer is yes. Francis had a strong will, but there were signs that his health had gotten worse much faster than most people would have thought. He was not the type of person to complain. He often played down his own problems because he had work to do. In interviews in the past, Pope Francis often talked about death in a way that seemed calm and accepting. "When the Lord calls me, I will go," he said one time. In hindsight, these words, which he spoke many years before he died, almost sound like a prophecy. He clearly never feared death. Instead, he accepted it with the same faith and grace he had shown his whole life. Even though he knew he was going to die, his failing health still had a huge effect on him. Some people think that Pope Francis may have spent months or even years getting ready for his death. One of the things that made him a great pope was his ability to suffer in silence and use his suffering to help others. He believed that suffering could be very good for you spiritually if you faced it with love. He may have chosen to go through his pain without telling anyone about it because of this view. He seemed to be choosing to suffer on purpose so that his flock would be better off. Another idea is that Pope Francis modeled his last hours after those of John Paul and Benedict XVI. Both were known for being humble and accepting of their roles, especially as their health started to get worse. John Paul II died only 33 days after being elected as Pope. Benedict XVI chose to step down as Pope because of health problems, which was not the norm. Like these ancestors, knew what it meant to be a leader, but also knew that getting old or sick can make it hard to do things. One of the most moving things about Pope Francis' last days was the way he chose to deal with his death. He never asked people to feel sorry for him. Instead, he stuck to his goal and kept praying for the world even though his body was breaking down. He is said to have seen his pain as a way to connect with Christ's pain, not as something to be carried. Getting this done gave him peace of mind that let him face death with honor. The exact nature of his health problems were something he never told everyone about. During most of his time as Pope, he hid his physical pain behind a public persona that made him look strong and active. Now, though a lot of people are wondering how much of his pain did he really hide from everyone? Also, why did he choose to handle it alone instead of asking for help or showing how hard it was on him? Because of his health problems being kept secret, his last days are even stranger. He kept being Pope even though he had a lot of health problems that would have made him quit sooner. He taught us to accept what is going to happen with grace and to suffer quietly for the sake of others. This may have been the most important thing he left behind. As the world honors Pope Francis, one thing is clear. His life will be remembered for more than just what he did as Pope. It will be remembered for how he dealt with problems. Not only did his death end his time as Pope, but it was also a final, powerful statement of his faith and the strong will that gave him the strength to suffer and lead the Church until the very end. Pope Francis's funeral broke centuries of tradition. Was this a final act of defiance or a personal choice? The Pope who broke tradition. In more ways than one, Pope Francis's funeral marked the end of an era and a turning point in history. It was more than just a ceremony. Many times his death was a quiet protest against centuries of Vatican tradition. Everything about him, every choice he made before and after he died, seemed to show that he didn't want to follow the strict rules of the papacy. His funeral was not the only one. Following church practice, the first things that were done after Pope Francis died, the Camerlengo, who was in charge of the papal government when there was no pope, confirmed his death. This is when the Vatican officially says that the Pope has died. The papal ring that stood for power, the ring of the fisherman, was destroyed at this very moment. This ring has been cut in half every time a pope dies to mark the end of his pontificate. This practice goes back hundreds of years. Even though it was a quiet, formal event, we soon learned that it was just the beginning of a series of decisions that went against the rules. The next one was just a break from the history of the popes over the past 600 years. As had been the norm for many years, Pope Francis chose not to be buried under St. Peter's Basilica. He had already made a name for himself by turning the Vatican upside down. Instead, he did something brave. He asked to be buried at St. Mary, Major Basilica, which is one of the most important churches in Rome. This church, which is known for its spiritual and historical importance, was not the usual place for a pope to rest. People in and outside of the Vatican were curious about the choice. Many wondered if it was a sign of rejection of the hierarchy and formality that come with papal tradition. This choice was very important to me personally. Pope Francis had always cared about people. Not only did he lead the Catholic Church from a very, very far away, he was also one of the people he made it a point to reach out to the poor, the forgotten, and the people who were left out. In many ways, his last words were his choice to be buried in a church that was easy for people to get to instead of a big tomb under the Vatican. He didn't want to stay hidden behind the shadow of the Pope. He wanted to stay with the people. There was some unrest in the Vatican over the choice, especially among the more conservative parts of the church. A lot of people saw this as a last act of defiance. It's possible that Pope Francis chose this time to give the church one last message because he knew his time was running out. Was this his last challenge to the long-standing rules of the Vatican? His funeral became a place where people from the old guard and those who want change could argue. This is called custom and reform in the Catholic Church. On the day of his funeral, his coffin was carried through the streets of Rome and everyone watched. The international procession was a true historical event. It looked like everyone in the world had come together to honor a man who had taken on the role of the Pope. Thousands of people came out into the streets to show their respect. Many carried candles, yelled prayers, and showed strong emotion. It was heavy with sadness, but there was also a strong sense of gratitude for a leader who had made such a big difference in the world. While it was done with great respect, the procession was clearly not like other papal funerals. It wasn't just a funeral. It was the end of an era here. Some people thought it was the end of the papacy, but it wasn't just the end of a pope. This funeral showed how Pope Francis had changed the way people around the world saw the Vatican for good. The event's emotional impact went beyond the streets of Rome. People from all over the world watched in silence as cardinals carried Pope Francis's body. This was a sign of the Church's unity and the loss of a man who had led it through one of its hardest times. The crowd's honest feelings spoke volumes. They were sad about the death of a pope and a man who had lived a humble, kind, and fair life. His funeral turned into a meditation session for people all over the world. One of the most powerful pictures was the view of St. Mary Major Basilica from above, which is where Pope Francis would be buried. The history and importance of this holy site were very different from the Vatican grottos where many of his ancestors were buried. The placement of the two sites together spoke to Pope Francis' style of papacy, which is based on humility, simplicity, and a close connection with the people. Pope Francis's funeral was more about the legacy he left behind